Stop touching him. The billionaire's voice cut through the marble hallway like breaking glass. The words echoed beneath the tall ceilings of the Whitmore estate, a mansion so large that even whispers seemed to travel for miles. Naomi Carter froze beside the doorway, her hand hovering in the air just inches from the small boy sitting on the polished floor. Ethan Whitmore did not look at his father. He did not react to the shouting. Instead, he stared quietly at the spinning wheels of the small toy car in his hands, watching the light from the chandelier reflect across its silver paint. The room held its breath. Richard Whitmore stood several feet away in a dark tailored suit that probably cost more than Naomi earned in a month. His jaw was tight, his eyes cold with exhaustion. The boy on the floor was his son, the only thing left of a life that had shattered after his wife died 3 years earlier. Doctors had tried. Therapists had tried. Specialists had flown in from cities across the country. None of them had reached Ethan. The boy had been born without the ability to hear, and over time he had retreated deeper into silence than anyone could understand. Servants learned quickly to keep their distance. Loud reactions only made Ethan panic. But Naomi had only been working at the mansion for 3 days. She had not yet learned every unspoken rule. She had simply seen a small boy sitting alone on a cold marble floor in a house big enough to swallow a neighborhood. So she had stepped closer. Slowly. Carefully. Now the billionaire's warning hung in the air like a locked door. Naomi lowered her hand, but did not step away. The boy finally lifted his eyes. For the first time since the shouting began, Ethan Whitmore looked directly at someone in the room. And that someone was not his father. It was the quiet maid standing near the doorway. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The silence inside the Whitmore mansion grew heavier after that moment. Ethan studied Naomi with a strange calm that no one else in the room had ever seen from him. Usually strangers caused panic. Usually he screamed, or covered his ears even though he could not hear. But now the boy simply watched her, curious, almost cautious, as if trying to understand why she felt different from everyone else. Naomi felt the weight of Richard Whitmore's gaze behind her. She could practically hear his patience thinning even though the room itself remained silent. Outside the tall windows, the late afternoon sun stretched across the manicured lawns, turning the glass walls into sheets of gold. Naomi took a slow breath and gently lowered herself to one knee, so she was no longer towering above the boy. Ethan's fingers stopped spinning the toy car. His eyes flickered with interest. Something about the way Naomi moved was different from the hurried professionals who had tried to treat him before. She was not rushing. She was not demanding anything. She simply sat there, steady and calm, as though the enormous mansion around them had suddenly become very small. Across the room, Richard Whitmore frowned. He had built technology companies worth billions of dollars. He had negotiated deals that moved entire markets. Yet nothing in his world had prepared him for the strange stillness now settling between his son and a maid who had been hired only days earlier. He opened his mouth to order her away again. But before he could speak, Ethan Whitmore did something that no therapist had managed to make him do in nearly a year. The boy slowly lifted his hand, and he pointed directly at Naomi Carter. The boy's small finger remained pointed toward Naomi Carter as if he had discovered something no one else in the room could see. The movement was simple, almost quiet, yet it sent a ripple of confusion through the vast marble hallway of the Whitmore estate. Richard Whitmore stood frozen several steps away, his expression tightening with disbelief. Ethan Whitmore had not pointed at anyone in months. Most days the child barely acknowledged the presence of the people around him. Therapists had described it as withdrawal. Doctors had called it emotional isolation. To Richard it felt like losing his son piece by piece inside a silence he could not break. Naomi did not move immediately. She remained kneeling where she was, her posture calm and steady, her eyes focused on the boy rather than the billionaire standing behind her. Ethan slowly lowered his hand and studied her face again. The toy car rested forgotten beside his knee. His dark eyes searched Naomi's expression the way children often do when they are trying to decide whether someone is safe. Naomi felt a quiet pull in her chest. She had seen that look before. Years ago in a small apartment in Atlanta, her younger brother used to stare at strangers in the exact same way before deciding whether he trusted them. The memory passed through her mind like a soft shadow. Naomi lifted one hand slowly and placed it gently against her own chest. The movement was deliberate and careful, slow enough that the boy could follow it easily. Ethan's gaze dropped to her hand. For a moment the entire room seemed suspended in stillness. Behind them one of the household staff shifted nervously near the doorway. Richard Whitmore folded his arms across his chest, watching the interaction with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant curiosity. Naomi moved her hand away from her chest and slowly opened her palm toward the boy. It was not a command. It was an invitation. Ethan blinked once. Then he looked down at his own small hand resting on the floor. The boy hesitated for several seconds that felt much longer than they were. Richard felt his heart begin to pound harder against his ribs. He had seen specialists attempt similar gestures before. They always failed. Ethan usually turned away or pushed people aside when they tried to force interaction. Yet something about this moment felt different. Naomi did not speak. She did not rush. She simply waited. The light from the chandelier above them reflected softly across the polished marble floor, creating gentle circles of gold around the two figures sitting several feet apart. Finally, Ethan lifted his hand. The movement was uncertain at first, as if he was testing the space between them. His fingers opened slowly, mirroring the shape Naomi had shown him seconds earlier. A quiet breath escaped from one of the housekeepers near the wall. Richard Whitmore felt his shoulders stiffen. Ethan rarely copied gestures from anyone, but the boy's hand now hovered in the air, awkward yet deliberate, echoing Naomi's movement almost perfectly. Naomi's eyes softened. She slowly brought her hand back to her chest again and repeated the motion. Her palm touched her heart for a brief moment before extending outward toward the boy once more. Ethan watched closely. Then he did something that made Richard Whitmore take a single stunned step forward without realizing it. The boy touched his own chest. Not randomly. Not in panic. He pressed his small hand over his heart the same way Naomi had done. Then he lifted his eyes and looked directly at her again, as if waiting to see what she would do next. The boy kept his hand pressed against his chest, his small fingers resting exactly where Naomi Carter had placed hers moments earlier. The gesture was simple, almost fragile, yet it landed in the enormous Whitmore hallway with the weight of something no one had expected. Naomi did not rush to respond. She understood that moments like this could disappear if pushed too quickly. Instead, she nodded slowly, her eyes warm with quiet encouragement. Ethan Whitmore watched her face carefully, studying every small movement the way a child studies a puzzle piece that might finally fit. Behind them, Richard Whitmore felt a strange tightness rise in his chest. He had spent years in boardrooms where silence meant tension or negotiation. But this silence was different. It was softer, more fragile, like something alive that could break if anyone spoke too loudly. Naomi lowered her hand from her chest and gently pointed toward the boy. The motion was slow and patient. Ethan followed the direction of her finger. Then Naomi placed her hand over her heart again and held it there for a brief moment before pointing toward him once more. The meaning was not spoken, yet the message carried through the quiet space between them. Ethan blinked as if thinking. His small brow tightened slightly while he processed the movement. The staff standing along the walls watched with wide eyes, afraid to interrupt whatever strange communication was unfolding in front of them. Richard Whitmore stepped forward another pace before stopping himself. Every instinct in his mind told him to take control of the situation, yet another quieter instinct whispered that he should not interfere. Ethan slowly lifted his hand again. He hesitated in the air for a second before pressing it against his own chest once more. Then he extended his finger and pointed directly at Naomi. The motion mirrored hers almost exactly. Naomi felt her breath catch gently in her throat. She gave the boy a small approving nod. For a child who had been described as unreachable, this moment carried an enormous meaning. Richard Whitmore stared at his son in stunned disbelief. He had seen doctors attempt to teach Ethan communication through structured sessions that lasted hours. They used charts, electronic screens, and specialized toys designed to encourage interaction. Most attempts ended with the boy withdrawing deeper into silence. Yet here in the center of his own home, a maid who had worked for him less than a week had managed to reach him with nothing more than patience and a simple gesture. Naomi slowly shifted her weight, so she was sitting more comfortably on the floor. The marble surface beneath her knees was cool through the fabric of her uniform, but she did not seem to notice. Her full attention remained on Ethan. She gently placed both hands in front of her with her palms open. Ethan watched closely. Naomi brought her right hand toward her chest again, this time touching her heart, and then lightly pointing toward herself. Ethan studied the motion. His lips parted slightly as if he was trying to understand the pattern. Naomi waited again, giving him time. The seconds stretched quietly. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon sun moved lower across the sky, casting long beams of golden light across the polished floor. Finally, Ethan attempted to repeat the movement. His hand rose slowly. He touched his chest again, and then pointed toward Naomi just as she had done earlier. Naomi's smile grew a little wider, though it remained gentle and calm so the boy would not feel overwhelmed. Richard Whitmore felt something shift inside him that he could not explain. For years he had believed his son lived behind an invisible wall no one could cross. Yet in this moment the wall seemed to flicker with the possibility of a door. Ethan tilted his head slightly and looked at Naomi with growing curiosity. Then the boy reached down and picked up the small silver toy car resting beside his knee. He held it in his palm for a moment before slowly sliding it across the marble floor toward her. The small silver toy car slid slowly across the polished marble floor until it stopped just inches from Naomi Carter's knee. The movement was gentle but unmistakable. Ethan Whitmore watched closely as the toy reached her, his dark eyes wide with quiet concentration. In a house where he rarely shared anything with anyone, the gesture felt almost unbelievable. Naomi did not grab the car immediately. She understood the meaning behind the moment. Children like Ethan did not simply hand things away, especially not to strangers. She slowly lowered her gaze to the toy resting near her knee, then lifted her eyes back to Ethan with a warm expression that carried gratitude without overwhelming him. Carefully she reached forward and picked up the small car between her fingers. The metal surface caught the afternoon light, sending a soft reflection across the floor. Naomi studied it for a brief second, as if it were the most valuable object in the room. Then she gently rolled the toy back toward Ethan. The car traveled in a smooth line across the marble until it stopped beside the boy's hand again. Ethan watched the entire movement. His eyes followed the wheels as they turned. Then something unusual happened. The corners of his mouth lifted slightly. It was not a full smile, but it was enough to make the staff along the wall glance at each other in quiet disbelief. Richard Whitmore felt the change immediately. For months, Ethan's face had been blank, distant, locked in a silence that made every attempt at connection feel impossible. Yet now there was the smallest hint of warmth there. The boy picked up the car again. He studied Naomi for a moment before slowly rolling the toy back to her one more time. Naomi understood the invitation. She rolled it back again. The two of them repeated the motion several times, the small car traveling quietly across the shining floor like a bridge being built between two separate worlds. Richard Whitmore remained still, watching every second unfold with an intensity he usually reserved for billion-dollar negotiations. Each exchange felt almost unreal. Ethan was sharing attention. He was engaging in a simple game, something that no specialist had managed to achieve despite years of expensive therapy. Naomi finally let the toy stop in front of her hand and lifted her gaze toward the boy again. Slowly she pointed to herself with two fingers touching her chest. Her lips moved gently even though she knew Ethan could not hear her voice. Naomi. The word formed clearly on her mouth so the boy could see it. Ethan studied her lips with focused attention. Many deaf children learned to read faces long before they learned structured communication. Naomi repeated the motion again, touching her chest and shaping the same word. Naomi. The boy blinked once. His eyes moved from her lips to her hands. He watched carefully. Naomi waited without rushing him. After several seconds, Ethan lifted his hand uncertainly. He tapped his chest with his fingertips, just as she had done earlier. Naomi's expression brightened slightly with encouragement. The boy hesitated before moving his lips slowly. The sound that came out was soft and unclear, more breath than voice. But the attempt itself filled the hallway with a quiet shock. Nah. The unfinished syllable faded quickly, but Naomi nodded gently, as if the boy had spoken a perfect sentence. Richard Whitmore felt his heart pound harder. His son had not attempted to form a word in front of anyone outside a medical office in more than a year. Yet here he was trying to echo the name of a woman who had been cleaning the halls of his mansion only days earlier. Naomi placed the toy car gently on the floor again and slid it toward Ethan one more time. This time the boy did not send it back right away. Instead, he looked up at her with growing curiosity. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Ethan lifted his small hand again and made a new motion that none of the staff in the hallway had ever seen before. He tapped his chest once more. Then he pointed toward Naomi. And this time his lips moved again, a little more clearly than before. The boy tapped his chest once more, then pointed toward Naomi Carter, and this time his lips formed the sound a little more clearly. Naomi. The word was broken and soft, almost carried on air, yet it was unmistakable. Naomi felt a quiet warmth spread through her chest. She did not clap or react too strongly because she knew sudden excitement could overwhelm him. Instead, she gave Ethan the same calm smile she had worn since the beginning. She nodded slowly as if what he had done was the most natural thing in the world. Yes, she whispered gently, even though she knew he could not hear the sound. Naomi. Ethan watched her mouth carefully. His small brows lifted with curiosity, as if he had just unlocked a door he did not realize existed. Around them, the massive Whitmore mansion had gone completely still. The housekeeper standing near the far wall covered her mouth with her hand in disbelief. Another staff member leaned slightly forward, afraid to breathe too loudly and interrupt the moment. Richard Whitmore stood several feet away, unable to move. His son had not attempted to repeat a name like that in front of anyone outside a medical office in more than a year. And now he had done it here, in the middle of the hallway, while playing with a maid who had been working in the house for less than a week. Naomi slowly touched her chest again. Naomi. She repeated the motion carefully so Ethan could watch her lips form the sound again. Then she gently pointed toward the boy. Ethan. The boy studied her mouth with deep concentration. Many deaf children learn to follow lips as carefully as others listen to sound. Naomi repeated the gesture once more. Her hand touched her chest again, and then she pointed to him. Ethan. The boy blinked several times, thinking. Then he slowly raised his hand. He touched his own chest exactly the way Naomi had done earlier. His lips moved with effort. Then. The syllables were uneven but clear enough to send a visible shock across Richard Whitmore's face. Naomi nodded again, offering the boy the same calm encouragement she had given him before. Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly. For the first time since the moment had begun, the boy looked away from Naomi for a brief second. His gaze shifted toward his father. Richard Whitmore felt the movement immediately. Their eyes met for only a moment, but that moment carried the weight of months of silence between them. The billionaire had spent years trying to build a world that protected his son from frustration and confusion. Yet somehow that protection had also built a wall between them. Ethan's attention returned to Naomi again. He pushed the small silver car toward her once more, the wheels gliding softly across the marble floor. Naomi caught it gently and rolled it back again. The quiet game continued, the toy traveling between them like a silent conversation. Richard Whitmore felt a strange emotion rising in his chest. Hope. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to feel that word that he barely recognized it. Naomi finally allowed the car to stop between them and rested her hand beside it. She studied Ethan for a moment before making a new motion with her hands. Slowly she raised both of her hands and formed a simple shape near her chest, a gesture small and graceful that carried meaning beyond words. Ethan watched closely. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the position of her fingers and the direction of her movement. Naomi repeated the motion again, patient and steady. Ethan hesitated, then slowly lifted his own hands. His fingers moved uncertainly as he tried to copy the shape Naomi had shown him. It was not perfect, but it was close enough that Naomi's smile softened even more. Across the hallway, Richard Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the quiet exchange. He had spent a fortune on experts who claimed to understand communication with deaf children. Yet none of them had managed to reach Ethan in the way Naomi seemed to do so effortlessly. The boy lowered his hands after the attempt and looked up at her again, waiting to see her reaction. Naomi nodded with quiet approval. Then she made the gesture once more. Ethan tried again. This time his fingers matched hers almost perfectly. And in that silent moment, Richard Whitmore realized something that made his heart pound harder than any business victory he had ever experienced. His son was learning, and the one teaching him was the quiet maid kneeling on the marble floor. Naomi Carter kept her hands raised calmly in front of her chest, repeating the same gentle gesture again so Ethan Whitmore could study it without pressure. The boy watched with intense concentration, his dark eyes following every small movement of her fingers. The hallway of the Whitmore estate remained wrapped in silence so deep that even the faint hum of the air vents seemed louder than usual. Sunlight continued to pour through the tall glass windows, spreading across the marble floor in long golden reflections. Ethan lifted his own hands again. This time his fingers moved with more confidence. He copied Naomi's gesture almost perfectly, though the angle of his wrist was still slightly uncertain. Naomi nodded slowly with approval. Her reaction remained soft and steady, never sudden or overwhelming. She understood that children who lived in silence often noticed energy before anything else. If she moved too quickly, the moment could disappear. Ethan lowered his hands for a second and then tried again without waiting for instruction. The shape of his fingers improved. Naomi smiled gently and tapped her chest again, then repeated the same sign once more. The gesture meant friend. Ethan blinked thoughtfully as he watched her repeat the movement. Then he touched his own chest and tried to copy it again. Friend. The sign was not perfect, but the intention was clear. Naomi gave a small nod of encouragement. Across the hallway, Richard Whitmore felt something shift deep inside his chest. For years, specialists had described his son as unreachable. They said Ethan struggled to build social connections because the world around him had always been confusing and loud in ways he could not control. Yet now the boy was learning a word that represented connection itself. Friend. Richard felt his throat tighten slightly. The sight of Ethan repeating the gesture felt like watching the first brick of a bridge being placed between his son and the rest of the world. Naomi slowly lowered one hand and gently slid the small silver toy car toward Ethan again. The wheels rolled quietly across the marble until they stopped against the boy's knee. Ethan picked it up and held it in both hands. Then he looked up at Naomi again. This time his eyes carried a new expression that had not been there earlier. Trust. Naomi raised her hand again and repeated the sign for friend once more, touching her chest and shaping the movement slowly so Ethan could see every detail. The boy followed again, copying the gesture more smoothly than before. Naomi nodded again. Friend. She pointed to herself with both hands touching her chest, then repeated the sign once more. Ethan studied her lips as she silently shaped the word. Then he lifted his hand and made the gesture again, pointing toward her afterward. The meaning was simple but powerful. Naomi understood immediately. Ethan was calling her his friend. The housekeeper near the wall quietly wiped moisture from the corner of her eye. Even the stern estate manager standing beside the staircase seemed frozen in place. Richard Whitmore slowly took another step forward without realizing it. For months, he had watched therapists attempt to guide his son through structured exercises that rarely produced results. Yet here in the quiet center of his own home, a woman who had arrived only days earlier was reaching Ethan through patience and empathy alone. Naomi lowered her hands and allowed a few seconds of silence to settle between them. Then she gently pointed toward Ethan again and repeated the sign once more. Friend. Ethan copied it immediately this time, his fingers forming the gesture with surprising confidence. Naomi gave a soft approving nod. Then she slowly turned her head and looked toward Richard Whitmore for the first time since the moment had begun. The billionaire stood motionless several feet away, his expression no longer cold or guarded. It had softened with something unfamiliar. Naomi lifted her hand again and repeated the same gesture, this time directing the sign gently toward Richard. Friend. Ethan followed her gaze. His eyes moved from Naomi to his father. The boy hesitated for a moment before slowly lifting his own hand. Then he made the same sign again while looking directly at Richard Whitmore. Richard Whitmore did not move when Ethan Whitmore lifted his small hand and repeated the sign Naomi Carter had shown him. The boy's fingers formed the gesture carefully, slowly, as if he was holding something fragile in the air between them. Friend. Ethan looked directly at his father while making the motion again, his dark eyes searching Richard's face for a reaction. For a moment the billionaire simply stared. The hallway of the Whitmore estate seemed to shrink around them, the towering walls and polished marble suddenly feeling smaller than the silent space between a father and his son. Richard Whitmore had faced powerful investors, ruthless competitors, and negotiations that decided the future of entire companies. Yet none of those moments had ever made his chest feel as tight as this one. His son was reaching toward him in a way he had not done in a very long time. And Richard did not know how to respond. Naomi Carter noticed the hesitation immediately. She understood the look in Richard's eyes. Many parents of deaf children experienced the same fear. They wanted to help, but did not know how to step into the quiet world their child lived in. Naomi slowly turned her body slightly toward Richard without breaking the calm atmosphere surrounding Ethan. She raised her hand again and repeated the gesture gently. "Friend." Then she pointed softly toward Ethan, inviting Richard to try the same movement. Richard hesitated. His hands remained at his sides for several seconds. He felt the weight of every employee in the hallway watching him. But more than that, he felt the quiet expectation in his son's eyes. Ethan was still holding his hand up, repeating the same sign patiently. "Friend." Naomi gave Richard a small, encouraging nod. The billionaire slowly lifted his own hand. The motion felt strangely unfamiliar, like learning a new language with muscles he had never used before. His fingers moved awkwardly as he tried to copy the shape Naomi had shown earlier. The first attempt was clumsy. Naomi gently repeated the gesture again so he could see the position clearly. Richard tried again. This time the shape was closer. Ethan's eyes brightened immediately when he saw his father attempt the sign. The boy leaned forward slightly, his attention fully fixed on Richard's hands. Naomi gave another soft nod. Richard Whitmore repeated the gesture one more time. "Friend." The movement was still imperfect, but it was clear enough that Ethan understood. The boy's face changed instantly. A smile spread across his lips, wider than anything Richard had seen in months. Ethan quickly repeated the sign back toward his father, his fingers moving with excitement now rather than hesitation. "Friend." Richard felt something break open inside his chest. The expression on his son's face was something he had been afraid he might never see again. The boy slid the small silver toy car across the marble floor toward his father for the first time. The car rolled quietly until it stopped near Richard's shoe. For a second, the billionaire stared down at the toy as if it were a priceless object. Then he bent slowly and picked it up. Ethan watched carefully. Richard crouched down so he was closer to his son's level. The marble floor felt cold through the fabric of his trousers, but he barely noticed. He gently rolled the car back toward Ethan the same way Naomi had done earlier. The toy traveled smoothly across the floor and stopped beside the boy's knee again. Ethan picked it up with both hands and looked between Naomi and his father with growing excitement. Naomi felt warmth fill the quiet space around them. She remained slightly behind the moment now, allowing the connection between father and son to take the center of the room. Richard Whitmore repeated the sign again, a little more confidently this time. "Friend." Ethan answered immediately, copying the gesture with a proud smile. For the first time in many months, the enormous Whitmore estate felt less like a silent fortress and more like a home where something fragile and hopeful had just begun to grow. The small silver toy car rolled back and forth between Ethan Whitmore and his father for several quiet moments, the soft sound of its wheels against the marble floor becoming the only movement in the enormous hallway. Richard Whitmore remained crouched now, no longer standing above his son like the distant figure he had been for so long. For the first time in many months, father and son shared the same level, only a few feet apart. Ethan pushed the toy again, watching carefully as his father returned it. Each exchange carried a silent rhythm, a conversation that did not need sound. Naomi Carter observed quietly from where she knelt a short distance away. She kept her posture relaxed so Ethan would not feel watched or pressured. Her eyes moved between the boy and his father with quiet satisfaction. Moments like this were fragile. If someone spoke too loudly or tried to take control too quickly, the connection could collapse just as suddenly as it had appeared. Ethan rolled the car again, then paused before pushing it back. This time his attention shifted toward Naomi. He lifted one hand and made the sign she had taught him earlier. "Friend." Then he pointed toward her with a small smile. Naomi touched her chest gently in response, acknowledging the gesture. "Friend." Ethan repeated the sign once more with confidence, then looked toward his father again. Slowly he lifted his hand and formed the same shape. "Friend." Richard Whitmore studied the movement carefully. He lifted his own hand again and copied the sign just as Naomi had shown him earlier. "Friend." Ethan's smile widened again. The boy leaned forward slightly, his curiosity growing stronger with every passing moment. Naomi noticed the way Ethan's attention moved between the two adults. The boy was beginning to understand that communication could exist between more than just himself and Naomi. It could include his father as well. Naomi gently lifted her hands again and formed another simple sign. This one was even easier than the first. She pointed toward Ethan and then slowly moved her hand outward toward Richard Whitmore. Then she repeated the motion again so the boy could follow the pattern. Ethan watched carefully, his eyes focused on every movement of her fingers. The meaning was clear even without words. Share. Ethan hesitated only briefly before pushing the toy car toward his father again. Richard Whitmore caught the small vehicle in his hand and paused before rolling it back. But this time, instead of sending it directly to Ethan, he gently rolled it halfway across the floor toward Naomi. The toy stopped between them. Naomi looked down at it with quiet amusement before rolling it back toward Ethan again. The simple game now included all three of them. Ethan laughed silently, the movement of his shoulders revealing his excitement even though no sound escaped his lips. The staff standing along the hallway exchanged surprised glances. Many of them had worked in the Whitmore estate for years and had rarely seen the boy display this much engagement. Richard Whitmore noticed it as well. Each small reaction from Ethan felt like a miracle unfolding 1 second at a time. Naomi gently lifted her hand again and repeated the sign for friend once more, this time pointing between Ethan and his father again. Ethan copied the movement instantly. Richard followed a moment later. The three gestures formed a quiet triangle of connection in the middle of the vast marble hall. Sunlight continued to pour through the tall windows behind them, casting long reflections that stretched across the floor like pathways of gold. For the first time since his wife had passed away, Richard Whitmore felt the heavy silence of his home begin to lift. And as Ethan pushed the toy car toward him again, the billionaire realized something that surprised him more than anything else that had happened that afternoon. The quiet maid kneeling beside his son had not simply helped Ethan speak with his hands. She had begun to bring life back into a house that had forgotten how to feel like a family. The toy car continued to move slowly across the marble floor, but the energy in the hallway had begun to change. What had started as a quiet moment of curiosity was now becoming something deeper. Ethan Whitmore sat with his legs folded beneath him, his attention shifting carefully between Naomi Carter and his father. Each time the car rolled across the floor, his eyes followed it with the focus of someone discovering a new language. Richard Whitmore returned the toy. Again, more gently this time, letting it stop closer to his son. Ethan picked it up and held it in both hands for a moment, instead of sending it back right away. His small fingers traced the edge of the metal wheels while he thought about something. Naomi noticed the shift immediately. Children often paused like that when they were preparing to communicate something more complicated. She kept her posture calm and waited. Ethan slowly lifted his head and looked directly at Naomi. Then he made the sign she had shown him earlier. Friend. Naomi touched her chest softly and nodded in response. Friend. Ethan smiled slightly, but then his expression changed as if another thought had entered his mind. The boy turned his gaze toward his father. Richard Whitmore felt the attention immediately and met his son's eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ethan lifted his hand again. This time his fingers formed a different movement. It was slower and less certain than the first sign Naomi had taught him, but it was clearly intentional. He pointed gently toward his father. Then he touched his chest. Then he pointed toward Naomi. Richard Whitmore did not understand the meaning yet, but Naomi did. She had seen that pattern many times before when children tried to express feelings they had not learned the official signs for yet. Naomi leaned forward slightly and repeated the gestures carefully so Ethan could see them again. She pointed toward Richard Whitmore. Then she pointed toward Ethan. Then she gently touched her own chest. Ethan watched closely and then repeated the same pattern again with growing confidence. Father, son, friend. The meaning settled into the quiet hallway like a soft echo. Richard Whitmore felt the words even though they were never spoken aloud. His son was telling him something simple but powerful. The boy was connecting the three of them together. Naomi saw the emotion rising in Richard's face. She understood that moment too. Parents of deaf children often felt the pain of distance long before they discovered the path back toward connection. Ethan looked at his father again, his eyes searching carefully for a response. Richard Whitmore slowly lifted his own hand, remembering the gesture Naomi had shown earlier. His fingers formed the sign again with more confidence now. Friend. Ethan's shoulders lifted with excitement. He immediately repeated the gesture back to his father, then pointed toward Naomi again as if making sure she was included. Naomi smiled warmly and answered with the same sign once more. Friend. The boy laughed silently again, the movement of his shoulders shaking with joy even though no sound came out. The toy car slipped from his hands and rolled a few inches across the marble floor before stopping. None of them reached for it this time. The game had already become something greater. The house staff remained quietly along the walls, watching the unexpected transformation unfold in the center of the hallway. Richard Whitmore slowly lowered himself the rest of the way onto the marble floor, so he was sitting beside his son rather than towering above him. The cold surface did not matter anymore. Ethan noticed immediately and leaned slightly closer to him. Naomi remained kneeling nearby, her presence steady and calm like a quiet guide who knew when to step forward and when to let the moment belong to others. For several seconds the three of them simply looked at each other in silence. Then Ethan lifted his hand again and made the sign one more time, this time pointing clearly at both Naomi and his father before touching his chest. Friend. The word friend still hung quietly in the air between them, even though no sound had been spoken. Ethan Whitmore lowered his hand slowly after finishing the gesture, but his eyes remained fixed on his father as if waiting for something more. Richard Whitmore felt that look settle deep inside his chest. For years he had believed that the silence surrounding his son was a wall that no one could cross. Now, sitting on the marble floor beside the boy, he realized that the wall had never truly been silence. It had been distance, and somehow Naomi Carter had shown them a way across it. The small silver toy car rested a few feet away where it had rolled earlier, forgotten for the moment, as something more important unfolded. Ethan looked down at his hands, studying them carefully, as if they now held a power he had only just discovered. Slowly he lifted them again. His fingers moved uncertainly at first, repeating the sign Naomi had taught him earlier. Friend. Then he pointed toward Naomi. Friend. Then he turned toward his father and repeated the gesture again. Friend. Richard Whitmore felt his throat tighten. He raised his own hand and carefully copied the movement again, this time with far more confidence than before. Friend. Ethan watched closely and nodded once, satisfied that his father understood. Naomi remained kneeling nearby, allowing the connection between father and son to grow without interruption. But after a few seconds, Ethan turned toward her again with a thoughtful expression. The boy lifted his hands once more. This time his fingers moved through a different motion, one that Naomi recognized immediately. It was slower and more careful than the others, shaped by memory rather than instruction. Ethan touched his chest. Then he pointed toward his father again. Then he moved his hands apart slightly, as if describing something that had once been broken. Richard Whitmore frowned slightly, unsure of the meaning. Naomi leaned forward gently and repeated the gesture so Ethan could confirm it. The boy nodded quickly and repeated the motion again. Naomi felt a quiet ache in her heart as the meaning became clear. She slowly turned toward Richard Whitmore and gently demonstrated the sign again with steady hands so he could understand. The gesture meant miss someone. Richard Whitmore stared at the movement for a moment before realization settled over him. Ethan was not only calling them friends. He was trying to say something deeper. The boy touched his chest again and pointed toward his father once more before repeating the motion that meant miss. Richard felt his breath catch slightly. His son was telling him that he missed him, not just in the present moment, but over all the months when the distance between them had grown too wide to cross. Ethan watched his father carefully, as if worried the message had not been understood. Richard Whitmore slowly raised his hand again, his fingers forming the sign Naomi had just shown him. Mississippi. Then he touched his own chest and pointed toward Ethan. Mississippi. The boy's eyes widened. His shoulders lifted with excitement as he repeated the gesture again, this time faster and with more confidence. Naomi felt warmth spread through the quiet hallway as she watched the exchange unfold. The employees along the walls stood completely still, sensing that something far more important than a normal afternoon was happening in the center of the room. Richard Whitmore lowered his hand slowly and looked at Naomi for a moment. His expression carried something that had not been present when the afternoon began. Gratitude. Without speaking, he gave her a small nod of understanding. Naomi returned the nod softly before turning her attention back to Ethan. The boy had already lifted his hands again, his fingers moving with growing excitement as he attempted another sign he had not yet been taught. The shape was awkward and unfinished, but the intention behind it was unmistakable. Ethan was trying to say something new, and both Naomi and Richard leaned forward slightly, waiting to see what their son would reveal next. Ethan Whitmore held his hands in front of him, his fingers hovering uncertainly in the air as he tried to form the next sign. His small brow tightened with concentration while he searched for the right movement. Naomi Carter recognized the expression immediately. It was the same look many children made when they were reaching for a thought that lived just beyond the words they already knew. She did not rush him. She remained still on the marble floor, her calm presence giving Ethan the time he needed to find his way through the moment. Richard Whitmore leaned forward slightly beside his son, his attention fully fixed on the boy's hands. The billionaire who once controlled rooms filled with powerful executives now sat quietly, waiting for a child to finish a sentence written in gestures instead of sound. Ethan finally moved his hands. The motion was uneven, as if he was building the sign from memory rather than instruction. First he pointed toward Naomi. Then he pointed toward his father. After that he touched his own chest again. Naomi watched closely, understanding that the boy was shaping an idea rather than repeating something he had been taught. Ethan paused for a second, then slowly brought both of his hands together in front of him. The gesture was clumsy but clear enough for Naomi to recognize. She felt warmth rise behind her eyes as the meaning settled in. Together. Ethan was trying to say that the three of them belonged together in that moment. Naomi gently repeated the sign so the boy could see it clearly. Together. She pointed toward Richard Whitmore, then toward Ethan, then toward herself before repeating the gesture again. Ethan's face brightened instantly when he saw the movement matched what he had been trying to express. He repeated the sign again with growing confidence. Together. Richard Whitmore watched the exchange carefully. Naomi turned toward him and repeated the gesture once more so he could understand it as well. Together. The billionaire looked from Naomi to his son and then slowly lifted his own hands. His fingers moved through the sign awkwardly at first, but he tried again until the shape became clear. Together. Ethan's reaction was immediate. The boy's shoulders lifted with excitement, and he quickly repeated the gesture again, his hands moving faster now that he felt understood. Naomi smiled softly, feeling the quiet strength of the moment spreading through the hallway. For years the Whitmore estate had been a place where silence felt heavy and isolating. Now that silence was beginning to feel different. It was no longer empty. It was full of meaning. Ethan lowered his hands briefly and then reached forward to pick up the small silver toy car again. He looked at it thoughtfully before placing it in the center of the floor between the three of them. Instead of pushing it toward one person, he left it there. Then he lifted his hands again and repeated the sign. Together. Naomi nodded gently, understanding the simple message hidden inside the gesture. The boy was saying that the game no longer belonged to just two people. It belonged to all of them. Richard Whitmore felt something shift inside him as he watched his son make the sign again. For months, he had believed that the silence in their lives meant loss. Now he understood that silence could also hold connection when someone knew how to listen. Naomi met his eyes for a brief moment and gave a small encouraging nod. Richard Whitmore looked back at his son and slowly repeated the sign again with steady hands. Together. Ethan's smile returned, brighter than before. The boy reached forward and gently pushed the toy car, so it rolled slowly between Naomi and his father, creating a small circle of movement on the marble floor that connected all three of them in the quiet center of the Whitmore home. The small silver toy car rolled slowly in a gentle circle across the marble floor, its tiny wheels catching the golden light that streamed through the tall windows of the Whitmore estate. Ethan Whitmore watched the movement carefully, his eyes bright with a quiet excitement that had not been seen in the house. For a very long time, Naomi Carter remained kneeling a few feet away, her posture relaxed and patient, allowing the moment to breathe. Richard Whitmore sat beside his son, still adjusting to the strange feeling of being part of a conversation that did not use sound. For years he had believed that communication meant speaking louder, explaining more, pushing harder for understanding. Yet everything he was witnessing now was happening through stillness and patience. Ethan reached forward and gently stopped the toy car with the palm of his hand. Then he lifted his eyes and looked at Naomi again. The boy raised both of his hands and slowly formed the sign she had shown earlier. Together, Naomi answered with the same gesture, her hands moving with calm certainty. Together, Ethan then turned toward his father. Richard Whitmore watched closely before repeating the movement himself. His fingers were steadier now, the unfamiliar language beginning to settle naturally into his hands. Together, Ethan's smile widened. The boy lifted the toy car again and held it between both of his hands before placing it back on the floor exactly in the center between the three of them. Naomi understood immediately. Ethan was no longer passing the car between one person and another. He was placing it where all three of them could reach it. Naomi slowly extended her hand and nudged the toy gently toward Ethan. Instead of keeping it, the boy rolled it toward his father. Richard Whitmore returned it again toward Naomi. The toy traveled between them again and again, forming a quiet triangle across the marble floor. The game was simple, but the meaning inside it was much larger than the small piece of metal moving back and forth. Ethan watched each movement with careful focus, his eyes shifting between Naomi and his father with growing comfort. For the first time in a long time, the boy looked completely present in the moment. Naomi lifted her hands again and showed another simple sign, moving slowly so Ethan could follow each part. She pointed toward Ethan first, then toward Richard Whitmore, and finally toward herself before repeating the same gentle motion that meant together. Ethan copied the gesture immediately. Together. Richard followed a moment later. Together. The three signs appeared almost at the same time, their hands moving in quiet harmony. Along the walls of the hallway, the household staff remained completely still, watching something they had never expected to witness inside the Whitmore mansion. The building that had once felt heavy with silence now held a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of understanding. Richard Whitmore looked down at his son and felt an emotion rise that he had not allowed himself to feel since the day his wife had passed away. Hope. Ethan lifted his hands again, but this time he made a new movement Naomi had not shown him before. His fingers touched his chest, and then slowly moved outward toward both adults sitting beside him. Naomi recognized the meaning immediately, even though the shape was imperfect. She gently repeated the movement, so Ethan could see it clearly. Family. Ethan's eyes lit up when he saw the sign repeated correctly. He quickly copied the motion again, pointing toward Naomi and then toward his father before touching his own chest once more. Family. Richard Whitmore felt his breath catch in his throat. For months the word had felt like something that belonged to the past. Yet now his son was rebuilding it piece by piece with his hands. Richard slowly raised his own hands and repeated the same sign. Family. Ethan laughed silently again, his shoulders shaking with joy as the meaning of the moment spread through the quiet room. And Naomi Carter, the maid who had arrived only days earlier, sat there smiling softly as she watched a father and son begin to rediscover the language that would bring them back to each other. The sign for family lingered in the air between them like a quiet promise. Ethan Whitmore repeated the movement once more, touching his chest before pointing toward his father and then toward Naomi Carter. Family. The gesture was still a little uneven, but the meaning was clear enough to make Richard Whitmore feel a deep warmth spread through his chest. For months the Whitmore mansion had been filled with a silence that felt heavy and empty, a silence that reminded him every day of what his family had lost. Yet now that same silence carried something different. It carried understanding. Richard slowly lifted his hands and repeated the sign again, his fingers moving with growing confidence. Family. Ethan watched closely and immediately copied the movement again with a proud smile. Naomi sat quietly beside them, her calm presence allowing the moment to unfold without pressure. The golden afternoon light continued to stream through the tall windows, stretching across the marble floor where the small silver toy car still rested between them. Ethan leaned forward and picked up the toy once more. He studied it for a moment, then gently placed it into Naomi's hand. The action surprised her slightly. She looked down at the small car before lifting her eyes toward Ethan again. The boy then pointed toward the toy, then toward Naomi, and finally toward his father before repeating the sign again. Together. Naomi understood immediately. The car was no longer just a toy in a simple game. It had become the small bridge that connected all three of them during the afternoon that had changed everything. Naomi rolled the toy gently across the floor toward Richard Whitmore. The billionaire caught it in his hand and looked at it thoughtfully before rolling it back toward Ethan. The boy laughed silently again as the car returned to him. The movement of his shoulders carried more joy than any sound ever could. After a moment, Richard Whitmore slowly stood up from the marble floor. He looked down at Naomi Carter with a new expression that had completely replaced the guarded look he had worn earlier that day. Respect. Gratitude. He extended a hand toward her, helping her stand as well. Naomi rose quietly, brushing the front of her uniform without drawing attention to herself. Ethan stood up too, still holding the toy car in his small hands. Richard looked at his son, then lifted his hands again and carefully formed the sign that Naomi had shown him earlier. Friend. Then he repeated the sign that Ethan had created only minutes before. Family. Ethan smiled and quickly answered with both signs again. Naomi watched the exchange with gentle warmth. Richard Whitmore turned toward her again and spoke softly, even though he knew Ethan could not hear the words. Thank you. Naomi simply nodded. She did not need recognition or praise. The quiet transformation she had witnessed was more than enough. Ethan stepped closer to his father and slipped his small hand into Richard's. The billionaire looked down and gently squeezed the boy's hand in return before lifting his other hand once more to repeat the sign they had all learned together. Together. Ethan answered immediately with the same gesture. Naomi returned it as well. And as the sun continued to lower behind the tall windows of the Whitmore estate, the house that had once been filled with lonely silence now held something warmer. It held connection. Because sometimes the most powerful voices are not the ones that are heard the loudest. Sometimes they are the ones spoken through patience, kindness, and a pair of quiet hands willing to listen.